For Creamer Media's Policy, I'm Sashni Madli. Joining me today is author Hannah J Dawson, here to unpack her book, Making a Life. So your book delves into the lives of these young men living in Zandspruit in Johannesburg and how they manage economic uncertainty. Why did you decide to focus on this particular community, and what were maybe some of the most unexpected things from your 14 years of ethnographic research?
Yeah, so in a sense, I sometimes say I didn't choose Zandspruit, it kind of chose me, and there's a long kind of story as to why I ended up in Zandspruit. The main reason was because there was a set of researchers doing research on political protests around the 2011 local elections, and Zandspruit was a community where there'd been a series of protests, but very little research had been done on this community. And so I got the contact details of some local political activists through a researcher, and really just arrived in Zandspruit at the time with an interest in understanding what was happening in this string of political protests, mainly because I was not persuaded by a dominant trope in the media at the time, which was that we have very high levels of youth unemployment, and that somehow automatically leads to political unrest. And so I really wanted to kind of dig deeper into what was happening in Zandspruit at that time and why were there protests in those moments when they're not in others. And that set the course of then more than 10 years of research. The bulk of the book is not on that early period of research, but I began to get very interested in Zandspruit as it relates to the wider part of Johannesburg that it's situated in. So that's one of the things I talk about in the book, that on the one hand, Zandspruit is very like many other informal settlements. It's a place that exemplifies the very difficult living conditions of the majority of Black South Africans. But one of the things that makes Zandspruit a little bit different from some informal settlements, even in Gauteng, for example, in the south of Johannesburg, is that it's now quite well positioned to a whole range of new economic hubs. So you can think of Lanseria Airport, you can think of Kaya Sands, there's all of these light industries, but it's also a site where South Africa's inequalities are extremely visible. So Zandspruit backs onto something called Jackal Creek Golf Estate. So within not even a kilometer's range, you've got the full extent of South Africa's inequalities. And so that's also made for me Zandspruit a really interesting place to really get into better understanding young men's lives and work decisions, and this whole idea of what does it mean and what does it look like to make a life in the context of South Africa's high unemployment and inequality, which is really the main focus of the book.
Now, your book also challenges the romanticized sort of views of survival on the margin. So how do the daily realities of these men actually differ from popular perceptions of resilience in informal settlements?
Yeah, so I think two things. So very early on, I wanted to get a much deeper sense of the local economy of Zandspruit. And so that was some of the earliest parts of my research, was getting a much deeper handle on what we might call the township economy or the informal economy. What I was very interested, being trained kind of in anthropology, was looking at how money moves in the community. So instead of being obsessed with the categorizations of who's a worker, are you employed or unemployed, because I started to realize quite quickly in conversations with people in Zandspruit that often these categories were not a very helpful way to understand how people actually made money, which often involved many strategies all at the same time. So in the book, what I try to do is I talk about Zandspruit as being a redistributive economy. And what I'm trying to highlight there is that there are significant numbers of people in Zandspruit who actually are employed in these local industries, factories, and people's homes, which are, fairly well located. But there are many more people who are not in employment, and how do they make money? And, yes, there is the usual many informal businesses, but what I became quite interested in is what were these often more invisible avenues in which young men access resources. And so in the book I talk about two strategies. The one I call hustling, which is kind of increasingly a very kind of common term to talk about anything outside of waged work, a way in which one acquires money. And then the other I call brokering. And these are just really broad categories to try and capture the real diverse range in which people without a stable waged job are doing their best to acquire resources, often in very unpredictable and insecure ways. And so hustling includes things like running a car wash business. It involves things like managing and the Izinyoka informal electricity network and infrastructure. It includes things like running an internet cafe. It includes drug dealing. It includes, really like a host of very, very diverse economic activities. And then brokering is a kind of category of economic activity that I think has received much less attention. In Zandspruit, in particular in the book, I'm trying to draw attention to the whole range of community organizations, local NGOs, many of which are youth-led, which are critical spaces through which young people not only spend their time, but also actually acquire resources. So in particular, I speak about one kind of youth-led community organization that organizes a variety of community events and initiatives, but this local organization becomes the network or the space through which it can access funds, either through government or through other bigger NGOs. And so I think about hustling and brokering as they're both really connected to local social relations, but also different types of politics. So to be able to access resources or take advantage of economic opportunities in both of these categories, you have to be really well embedded in the local community. So I guess that's one of the aspects of young men's lives and livelihoods that I'm trying to draw attention to, is there's actually many kinds of economic activities that men are involved in that often we don't give them as much attention as we perhaps should. Another big part of the book is really drawing attention to what I call the refusal of low-wage jobs. I think you asked the question, how does some of what I'm writing in the book challenge dominant perception? So the one is, I think, just to draw attention to that to be without a wage job doesn't mean one is idle or not engaged in economic activities, that there's actually much more happening in the local economy, and that local economy depends on people who are in waged employment. So that's showing the linkages between those who do go out into the nearby suburbs and factories and earn money. That money trickles back into the local economy, and those not in waged work access those resources through renting out shacks or managing the infrastructure, the informal electricity networks. But there's a whole chapter on the book which is really about understanding young men's work decisions as they relate to jobs. And I think very much a dominant narrative in South Africa, because we do have such extremely high unemployment, is that surely any job is better than no job. Or, if we could just get young people in jobs, then one of our biggest crises would be solved. And of course there is something to those arguments, but my book tries to kind of complicate that narrative. It really tries to highlight the question of the quality of the jobs available. And much of the work available as working in a Pick and Pay or a ShopRite, or working as a private security guard, or as a gardener, or as a day worker in construction, all of these are highly precarious, insecure jobs. And so what was particularly surprising to me very early on in my research was realizing that there were, in particular, young black South African men in Zandspruit who were very purposefully choosing to not get these jobs. Sometimes they'd done these jobs, sometimes on and off for many, many years, and then reached a point where they just realized these jobs weren't worth the time they took. And in the book I unpack why is it that some young men refuse these low-wage jobs, and what that means for how we think about South Africa's labor market, the politics around work in the South African context. But of course, being able to refuse a job also means you have other access to resources or other protections that maybe someone else doesn't. And so a big part of the book is trying to unpack what shapes young men's work decisions and what allows one person, for example, to say no to a very insecure, poorly paid job, whereas someone else is not able to make that choice. And so that became a big part of my interest, is understanding the local labor market dynamics, who does what to make money and why, and how do we actually understand those decisions as being dependent on how you are connected or not connected in Zandspruit's, what I call its local political economy. Yeah.
And there's also a notion in the book of making a life rather than merely surviving. Can you unpack that notion a bit more from your research?
Yeah, so, I mean, of course, it's the title of the book, Making a Life, and that became very important for me in that I think given the unemployment crisis, there's so much focus just on livelihoods, money, work. But the reality is that for actually all of us, I don't think this is true just for young men in Zandspruit, I think it's true for really all of us, is that all of us are trying to build lives in which work or accessing money is only one component of that. And so really I wanted the emphasis of this book to be on what I call life making. So the kind of overarching goal of the book is to provide an account of what it looks like, what it takes, under very, very harsh conditions to make a life, to forge a life in a place like Zandspruit. And so the book is kind of organized around these different components of what making a life is. So one component is around accessing a livelihood. But another part of building a life is about social identity, connection, belonging. Making a life is having a place that for you is home. So this is also connected to this idea of belonging and the politics of belonging, as well as questions around aspiration. So making a life is about the present, but it's also about a future horizon. So there's a chapter in the book just focused on young men's aspirations and how they foresee their futures, even though much of what's their futures is perpetually kind of out of reach in many ways. And then the last chapter of the book really looks at young men's political lives and the politics of the settlement. And I think that's again another component of making a life, is thinking about ourselves in relation to collective struggles or collective strategies of life making. So the book is around this idea of what does it take, what does it mean to have a life, to build a life in Zandspruit. And that's really how the book is organized, is around these different components of life making.
And given your research, what policy interventions do you believe are necessary to address the systemic issues faced by young men in informal settlements such as these?
Yeah, so I think quite purposefully didn't write this book to specifically answer any clear policy questions, but a book that is really trying to better understand the lives of the unemployed, that's trying to also draw attention to inequalities within informal settlements. So I think very often we think about informal settlements as very homogeneous spaces of deprivation and poverty. But when you take a much closer look, you really start to see that there's very important distinctions amongst people that live in Zandspruit. And the one that I really draw attention to in the book is the distinction between being a landlord and a tenant. So if you have to pay rent or not is actually a very, very important factor in determining if you take a very low paid job or not. It's a big component in the political economy of Zandspruit. So I guess the book doesn't set out to answer a specific policy question, but I do think there's much to be learned, or that the book can inform a series of important policy, but also just public conversations in South Africa. So one is around how do we think about the unemployment crisis? And I think my book doesn't provide any clear, simple answers to that. I think it provides a much more layered understanding of what the township economy looks like and where there might be opportunities there, but also, as you said, at no point in my book am I trying to romanticize this idea that the township economy is some easy solve for unemployment. As I showed throughout the book, the more vibrant the township economy is, or the local economy, it means the more formal wages or waged words actually are coming into that economy. So you can't think about the township economy as a solution outside of the wider economy. So I hope the book will speak to some of those conversations and policy debates. And then I think the other is also about how we think about informal settlements. And I think the book challenges some of the simplistic ways in which we think about informal settlements and draws attention to the kind of complexities of the local economy, the complexities of the housing and land market, but also these important forms of social differentiation or inequality within the settlement, all of which I hope will, and I believe they will be able to be valuable to policymakers and those doing important work on those issues. Yeah.
That was author Hannah J Dawson discussing her book, Making a Life.